Well,
Wow.
hello there, ladies and gentlemen out there in the audience. Want to thank you all for joining us tonight, and welcome to the second episode of Monday Night Monsters. I am Christopher Rondina here with my co-host Ronald Murphy,
Yeah,
and we'd
you
like
know
to
what?
welcome you on the board.
I deliberately tried not to be like a deer caught in the headlights whenever we came live, but it still was that momentary. I was watching the intro and everything, and I was immediately transfixed by all the graphics. I think it must be my ADHD kicking in, and I was unprepared to find myself now looking at myself on the computer screen. How have you been doing, Christopher?
Doing very well. It's been a nice week. I'm glad to see we've got some spring weather coming in up here in New England, where I am. Hopefully, it's a little warmer down there with you as well.
I think it's like 60 degrees right now. And as you mentioned, we are into our second show right now. Last week, we talked about werewolves, and it seems that you came through fairly unscathed.
Usually, yeah. Well, I've already been bitten once, so I've got pretty much
I,
all the transformations out of the way at this point.
I see. But we were so eager to get involved last week that we immediately dove into the deep end of the swimming pool and we started to tread water instead of wading in a little bit, a little bit into the shallow end at first. So we probably should introduce ourselves to the copious amount of viewers that we get.
We've already got 7 people out there. That's a very, very nice start for the evening. So, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Ron, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
All right, you know what? Great. Okay, so my name is Ron Murphy. I live in Western Pennsylvania, and one of the reasons why I was so excited to do a show on cryptozoology is because I use the moniker of cryptozoologist from time to time because it looks very impressive on a business card, doesn't it? It looks like I know what I'm talking about. But really, what is cryptozoology? So I do have a background in education. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree as well. But they are in the liberal arts. They're in literature and they're in history. So I kind of wanted to bring to light what kind of things I'm interested in and why I call myself a cryptozoologist. So I am interested in things that go bump in the night. And whenever you and I were on Ken DeCosta's show a few weeks ago, Ken suggested that we make a great pair because we have so many interests alike. And I think this is a way to bring people around that proverbial campfire and tell ghost stories.
Exactly, and I'm a bit of a storyteller myself. My name is Christopher Rondina. Some of you may have seen me. I've done a variety of podcasts with Dead Air and other places. I'm a bit of a legend hunter. I'm an author. A few years back, kind of tired of the ever-changing world of the publishing industry, I launched my own small independent press called Ghost Boy Press, and I do primarily local interest. I live in southern New England on the near the Connecticut and Rhode Island border here. We talk about local folklore, but I've been branching out into other folklore of the world, a lot of which we're going to be covering in this evening's show. So I consider myself not really a ghost hunter precisely. I've certainly been on a variety of ghost hunts in my day. I've spent a lot of great time with Ken DeCosta's group Rise Up Paranormal on some live locations, but mostly I'm out there searching for the legends, the iconic monsters and legends of the world, which is of course the core of what we're hopefully going to be doing over the course of our run here on Monday Night Monsters. And so of course we're always willing to hear folks' suggestions for iconic creatures that we might cover in future episodes. But tonight, of course, again, we're going to be doing cryptozoology. I'm going to be trying my best to hold my own against you, Ron, because you're really the cryptozoologist here. I'm definitely an amateur by all accounts on that. So I'm going to try and keep up with you.
Right. Well, everybody though is an amateur cryptozoologist because there's no place where I can attend a 4-year university or get a graduate degree in cryptozoology. So if anybody on the television, one of these talking heads, whenever the word cryptozoologist appears underneath their face there, that is a self-imposed term. You have to understand, right? And that's one of the reasons why I thought this show was so worthy of attention. We like to talk about Bigfoot. We like to talk about werewolves and vampires and all this other thing. So, what exactly is cryptozoology? What kind of monsters fall under the banner or the umbrella of cryptozoology? And what can science learn from this kind of pseudo kind of science that is out there on Discovery Plus and the Travel Channel.
Well, I think one of the fun things about this evening's episode is that of the 5 creatures we're going to try our best to get through this evening, all of the creatures we're going to be talking about exist not only in cryptozoology as something that may or may not exist in the natural world, but also have had a little bit of a presence in pop culture as the subject of a monster movie or some kind of a presence out there. And what we're going to start off with this evening is, back in the 1950s, I think it was 1954, when the Universal monster movie craze. You remember we were talking about Universal monster movies last week with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. But at the end of the 1940s, going into the 1950s, that kind of gothic horror thing was starting to take a back seat, and the age of science fiction was beginning to rise. And a very, very popular movie called Creature from the Black Lagoon was created in, I think it was 1954. But what a lot of folks don't realize is that Creature from the Black Lagoon, the story of a group that go down to the Amazon in search of this mysterious gill man, this creature which was supposed to be the missing link between fish and man, but that was inspired by a genuine story, a genuine creature that had been discovered a few years earlier. And so to me, I've always been fascinated by the story of the coelacanth. And I want to talk a little bit about that for us, Ron.
Right. Well, the coelacanth is one of these iconic living fossils, if you will. Right. It was something that was supposed to be extinct. We see it in the fossil record, and then lo and behold, off the coast of Madagascar, one of these things show up in a fishing net, relatively unchanged for the 360 million years they've been around. Now, this fish is so iconic that if you would go up to Bangor, Maine, which actually they just changed location from Portland, Maine to Bangor, but if you go up there with Lauren Coleman's Museum of Cryptozoology, this actually is the poster child for that particular museum because it means so much to cryptozoologists. Now, why does it mean so much? Well, one of the things is that it is indeed a living specimen. It's something that should not be there, but it's also something that can be examined under a microscope by science. It's one of these things that we're not relying upon photographs. We're not relying upon eyewitness accounts. We actually have this creature at our disposal to look at. And of course, in the recent years, people have photographed these things in the wild. They are an amazing creature, but they really have no business being around, right? I mean, they were missing from this planet for about 360 million years, except the locals knew about these things, right? The locals knew about these things, but we decided that what they had to say was an impossibility, so we quickly brushed it under the scientific rug, if you will. The good way I'm glad we started off with the coelacanth, because as we talk about other cryptozoological monsters such as Bigfoot or the Mapinguari from South America, or a plethora of these other creatures, a lot of these stories stem from the indigenous cultures. A lot of these stories are part of an oral tradition that we now see as either superstition or some sort of archaic type of storytelling. But the coelacanth was indeed known in the language and by the people of that particular area. We just refuse to believe it.
Now, as far as I understand it, even though coelacanths exist in the fossil record, it had been the opinion of the general scientific consensus that they'd been extinct at this point for at least 65 million years, and that back in the 1930s, I've heard this story. I think it was around 1937, 1938, that a fisherman hauled in a net, and when you haul in a net of fish, you've got sort of different expiration periods for different fish. You've got the normal fish, which die pretty quickly when you pull them out of the water. You have the sharks, which manage to hold on for an awfully long time. And there was this bizarre looking creature they caught in the net, which even after the sharks had expired, because of course they couldn't breathe out of the water, this enormous, strange looking fish with huge, bulky fins just kept gasping for air on the deck of the ship. And that they really had no idea what it is, and ended up bringing it to a museum or a biologist of some kind, and ended up in actually identifying it as a living coelacanth, something that at that point was firmly believed to be completely extinct. And as far as I understand, what's so interesting about this fish is not merely the fact that it is was believed to be extinct, but that what it is literally one of the missing links between animals of the water and animals of the land. The creature has incredibly large, strong, very muscular fins, and those fins it can almost use to propel itself on land. It has the ability water for an extraordinary length of time. Whether it's processing a little bit of oxygen or not, I don't know that for sure. But they actually originally believed that it was a species of lungfish because it was so capable of surviving out of the water. And they say that as far as what the coelacanth, what it's closest related to in the animal kingdom, although it is technically by all means a fish, they said it's more closely related to a tetrapod or an amphibian than it is to most other species of fish, which means that it is more closely related to a land animal than it is to almost any other fish in the aquatic kingdom. And that's an extraordinary thing, which is probably why a story like this ended up exciting the interest of the man who ended up writing the script for The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Creature from the Black Lagoon, of course, being a much more human creature. It was they were definitely bumping up the science fiction factor in there, but they wanted to portray an idea of a creature that bridged the gap between a land animal, basically between humanity and the realm of the sea.
Right, definitely a missing link. And when we think about this, well, I do want to backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit about the purpose of our show. One of the facets of our show is that we do want to bring in the world of the paranormal and the supernatural and the cryptozoological and project it onto a canvas of whatever generation we're particularly looking at. Because all these creatures mean something to different people at different times. So we were talking about the Wolfman last week. When we talk about vampires, all these great universal monsters, that was coming out of, we're going into World War II. It's kind of that gap between the horrors that were going into the world. But now with the Gillman, you have, and same way with Godzilla as well too, you have the unleashing upon the world now of nuclear power. It's now become a scientific age. And it's very interesting to see how our monsters, our fears, evolve with what's going on in the world around us, correct? I mean, that's really what's going on. I don't know if you could have made a movie like The Creature from the Black Lagoon even 10 years before its time, because it is rather a slap in the face at religion, if you will, because we're talking about indeed evolution going on, right? We're talking about us coming out of the primordial deep and crawling up onto land. So I don't think that you could have had The Creature of the Black Lagoon any time earlier than we have right now.
It is funny. The atomic age was a huge part of the science fiction boom of the 1950s and the 1960s, and it changed the nature of the horror film of that era. Even at that point, the supernatural creatures began to be portrayed as the result of some kind of science gone wrong. In fact, a lot of the most well-known movies of that time used very classic old world monsters like vampires and werewolves, but suggested the idea that scientists tampering with forces they shouldn't understand were creating them. And so it did really change the nature of horror and of public perception. It was kind of a very big folk change in the entire horror, in sort of the horror genre at that point.
Yeah, we've kind of unleashed these fears onto the world. It was our doing that these things are now prowling about the world, right? The Creature from the Black Lagoon would have been fine down in the Amazon, but we've decided in our superiority to take him out of his place and bring them into our world. And at that point, that is when all havoc starts arising.
So we have a fellow here was asking or suggesting the idea that one of the reasons that maybe cryptids are less commonly spoken about today is because places, I guess, because they've become a little bit more commonplace. And maybe there's some truth to that. I think that maybe in the age of internet, we have this idea that that we see all the time. We see these strange creatures, in home videos and everything. We've begun to maybe be a little more credulous in the way we believe in them. The idea that it's if we believe that if we see video evidence or we see a person claiming to have caught or have encountered one of these things, it's a little bit more easy to believe. And maybe as a result of that, we've stopped believing in or believing that we require scientific expeditions to explore these creatures. And that's a really dicey topic. I think that maybe there is some truth to that because information crosses the planet in a split second. But I also think that that really detailed scientific analysis of any cryptid creature, or really any any alleged development in science, probably needs to be examined by somebody who can be more objective, because often the people that are out there hunting for these creatures have a they have a particular mindset, and that doesn't always lend itself to sort of scientific objectivity.
Absolutely, that's the whole thing, right? So, what does cryptozoologists need to do in order to be accepted by mainstream science? Or is there anything, Chris, that they could do to be accepted? Or is it always going to be one of those fringe type of studies that is filled with crackpots and nutcases?
I think we often have to be able to take an example like the coelacanth and use it as a bludgeon sometimes to break through those barriers, because here's a creature that we completely believed to have been extinct. Scientific consensus was that it was extinct because it hadn't been found, and after apparently approximately 65 million years, despite the local folklore connected to it, we were finally able for the first time to document this thing's scientific existence. And when you look at that, and there are other similar cases, you suddenly realize that it is possible, even on a big planet like this where we feel like we've explored everything, it's possible that there are things out there that are hidden that we haven't found yet. And we've got to be able to, get the scientific community to open their mind to things like that. Right. I mean, the public's very open to it, but we need people who have a scientific mindset to be able to open their minds to it as well.
So let me play the devil's advocate here for a second, because what's going to happen with the case of the coelacanth is that it's going to be said that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do know about the depths of our oceans. And of course, everybody will probably concede that there's something swimming around out there that we simply have not cataloged yet. It comes to, the woods and our domain that we tend to have this overriding hubris concerning. That we think that we are the masters of this world, that we know everything that there is to know, so these things cannot possibly accept or exist in our space. Does that make any sense?
I think it does, and I think that there's always an element of that. And I actually want to quickly, Jeff has another question here. He says, do you believe that many cryptid legends come from the Appalachian tales and evolved as travelers headed west in the U.S.? And I would say not only is that a good example, but I think that kind of thing happened everywhere. And I want to harken back for just a moment, because we're going to be actually talking about something along these lines in a moment. I want to harken back to the last week's topic when we were talking about werewolves, because one of the reasons that werewolf legends almost certainly spread is because tribes who perhaps did not use animal skins in their rituals, maybe when they were far-ranging on hunting trips, or if they were being nomadic and they were traveling, would stumble upon other tribes that were dressed in these animal skins, howling and growling and running around on all fours. And in the firelight, by moonlight, or just not knowing what they were seeing, they were interpreting this in a very literal way. And so these legends were born that way. So yes, whether it's from the Appalachian Mountains spreading west across the U.S., whether it was nomadic tribes across the world, many cryptid legends probably spring from mystical or supernatural interpretations of something that they were seeing that was a comparatively natural event. We don't always believe the tales that these people relate, but often they're relating something they really saw. They're not just making it up. And so that gray area between fact and reality, or a fantasy and reality, is often a part of cryptid examination. And I am going to jump in from that to another one, because I think that this is a good segue point for it, which is back in the 1980s, the Howling movies were a big thing. And they were all these werewolf movies. There's about 20 of them all told. And most of them are absolutely terrible. But one of them, which came out probably 1986 or 1987, is probably the weirdest werewolf movie you'll ever lay eyes on. And if you're lucky, maybe you haven't seen it. And it's called The Howling 3, The Marsupials.
Mhm.
Now, if you're not familiar with marsupials, of course, marsupials are a class of animals that have a pouch. They give live birth in a pouch, and they're kangaroos, koalas, things like that are marsupial animals. But the idea of marsupial werewolves may have seemed a little bit strange to people who were watching this movie back in the 1980s. But the story was actually based on a real creature that existed at one point in time. And again, Ron, I'm going to turn this over to you because I think it's a creature that you know a fair amount about.
Yeah, one of my favorites, the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger right there. A good-looking animal, and that human beings are single-handedly responsible for driving this poor creature to extinction. Bounties were put on it. It was endangered, the cattle and the sheep herders that were going to New Zealand and Australia. So we wiped these creatures out. And the last one survived. What was it? About 1938 or something like that, right? I believe it was
I
the
think it was
last.
around 1936. The last one died in
Yeah,
captivity.
yeah, and that's a real shame. The interesting thing about these thylacines is that people are reporting them all the time. And I stated a couple of years ago that it was, in my opinion, that the next cryptid to be proven an actual living animal would have been the thylacine. There was some interesting images coming out of Australia that seemed to show this kind of a lithe creature with these great stripes on its back. But apparently they came out and that was indeed not the thylacine. But I am still hopeful that a remnant population of these things exist somewhere. I'm sure there was poison being used as well as firearms. But it's one of those things where we, in our infinite wisdom, decided it was best if we eradicated these creatures from the face of the earth because they simply were in the way of herding sheep.
And what's interesting about these creatures too is they're often referred to. Thylacine, if I understand the translation of it, literally means wolf with a pouch, or dog with a pouch, and they were called thylacine kenocephali, which we talked about the kenocephali, the
That's
dog
right.
heads, last week as part of our folklore discussion on werewolves. That these creatures had so many similarities to wolves that they often called it a Tasmanian wolf, but it also had a great deal of similarity to cat species, large cat species. So some people called it the Tasmanian tiger. And the truth is that nobody really even understood the sort of evolution of this creature. In fact, I have a graphic here that shows some of its relatives, and none of them cats or wolves. The thylacine is more closely related to most of the other marsupials out there, including marsupial rodents like the Dunnart, the Tasmanian devil, which actually bears a great deal of similarity to them. Now, all of these other creatures, the Dunnart, the Tasmanian devil, the Phascogal, that's quite a name, and the Noombat, which is an adorable little creature, kind of like a thylacine squirrel had a baby. All of these creatures still exist to this day, although unfortunately they are pretty seriously endangered. Only one that is currently believed to be extinct from starting around 1936 was the thylacine. But people have discussed the idea that with whether this is crazy or not, that with careful breeding, that the thylacine could actually be brought back using DNA from these various creatures. Now, that's a little more Jurassic Park than I usually like to get, but apparently there has been some serious discussion of whether the thylacine could be ultimately recreated using DNA from these other relative animals. So,
Well, we do know in existence right now, there is a thylacine pup that is in formaldehyde right now in Australia, where we would be able to get DNA out. And because these other animals are closely related, we probably could fool around. And like you said, produce some sort of Frankenstein version of that creature rather than getting right to it. But you had said about how remarkable of an animal it was. Again, that was simply not on the radar, right? And we're not talking about something that happened in the 16 or 1700s. This was in the 1930s, for goodness sake, and people still did not understand the idea of conservation. Whenever it comes to cryptozoology, you have to look at the idea of remnant species now, or remnants of that species. We're not talking about something like Bigfoot, something that's theoretical. We're talking about a creature that we did indeed know existed, and we knew it existed until a relatively modern era. So with that being said, it is the hope of a lot of cryptozoologists, people that are in search of hidden animals, of course, which the thylacine would be one, that there is at least a few of these creatures still out there in the bush somewhere. I'm still hoping on it. I still say that the best chance of us bringing a cryptozoological creature to light will be this one. I think that it's very possible that, like the coelacanth, it will rise out of the bush one day, and hopefully it will be brought to the table in a cage rather than on a slab. Again, I have the sincere hope that a lot of these creatures, because when we talk about cryptozoology, a lot of people automatically think of Bigfoot and they automatically think of Nessie. But cryptozoology, as I said, is the hunt for unknown animals or out of place animals. It is my hope that a lot of these creatures that are considered extinct by mainstream science are simply overlooked for right now. And I do hope that we run into a thylacine at some point, or even things like the ivory-billed woodpecker that lived to a relatively recent time, or the Carolina parakeet, if you ever heard of one of those. These are all cryptozoological animals as well. So when we talk about cryptozoology, it doesn't have to be the stuff of nightmares. It can be very mundane things that are simply driven to the brink of extinction by human greed or callousness or expansion.
And any time that an extinction could be reversed or proven to be wrong would obviously be something of a triumph, because we've done so much damage to this planet already. I wanted to quickly address one more thing that Jeff Hilton mentioned a moment ago, when he said that there's video that's been posted, and I know I've seen some of this of thylacines over the last several years. And I can say, Jeff, that I have seen some of both these still photos and videos, and what I have seen so far, the ones that are not overt hoaxes, haven't yet been convincing. I'd love to see something that's clear, something that's close up, and certainly we keep our fingers crossed for any of these lost animals that they will return someday. But so far, the evidence, at least for me, and I can be something of a skeptic, the evidence hasn't quite reached the level of convincing yet. Although I am absolutely eager to be convinced.
Absolutely. A few years ago, a very convincing looking video came out of what was believed to be a dodo bird. I don't know if you remember that or not. It was very convincing, but it turned out to be a hoax as well too. But the dodo bird is one of these creatures as well too that we wiped off the face of the planet. That I would love to see still lurking around someplace as well.
It's an interesting thing about all these hoaxes, and I'm sure that hopefully anyone in our audience would agree with this, is that the idea of hoaxing these creatures is so detrimental to the actual science of trying to track them down. If you're a cryptozoologist or an alleged cryptozoologist and you're actually perpetrating hoaxes, you're actually damaging the field, and that is really unfortunate, because you're impacting the credibility of the field, and that makes it difficult to get research funding. It makes it difficult to get people to take you seriously. And so you always hope that these people will not pull these kind of stunts, but it does happen. Very sadly, it does happen.
But the reason why they do it is
so let's move on.
I was going to say the reason.
Go on, Ron.
I was going to say the reason why they hoax these creatures is not so much because we're gullible; it's because we're hoping that they're still out there, right? I mean, that's the big thing, is that we have this hope and this wanderlust for the world around us, and people do take advantage of that. But that's the reason why we so easily fall into the trap, is we want to believe that they're still out there.
Yeah, very much. I think we want to believe. I mean, everyone wants to believe in the wonders of the world, and sometimes the wonders in the world are something as simple as a curious sort of a cat-wolf marsupial hybrid, and sometimes they're more extraordinary. I think there's a chapter in human folklore that I think everyone knows about and everyone is fascinated by. It exists in ancient folklore, and we see it all the time in modern interpretations. And that's our next topic, which is the subject of giants. Now, giants covers a really wide range of types of creatures. In fact, giants can refer to creatures from the natural world that have grown out of all proportion, as this, for instance, shows somebody who's very humanoid. Giants occur in biblical folklore, of course. We have the story, well-known story of David and Goliath. And you have, I think, one of the most fascinating biblical stories and one of the earliest references in human folklore to giants. Pardon me, I'm not trying ruffle any feathers by using folklore and the Bible in the same phrase, but the idea of the Nephilim. The Nephilim in the book of Genesis, and then later in, I think, Ezekiel, are supposed that angels, or these angelic creatures who had fallen from grace, came to earth, mated with human women, and gave birth to a race of these enormous powerful giants. And the Nephilim is something that a great number of people still believe existed in some way on the planet, and have claimed to find fossil evidence of, etc. And to me, that's always been fascinating.
It's for me as well too. Whenever you say the word Nephilim, that has a great deal of woo attached to it, doesn't it? I mean, it's one of those things where, because it can bring in ancient aliens, it can bring in, the demonic, religious aspects, all these kind of different things. But whenever I was writing my book on Bigfoot, on tracking Bigfoot through history, I came to this particular chapter whenever I was looking at the idea of these biblical giants. So I started to research the idea of the Nephilim a good bit, and this idea of the fallen ones, which is a word that's used to describe these creatures. Now, a lot of people take the word fallen as a verb, as if they descended from someplace. But a lot of scholars nowadays are suggesting that the term fallen means that they are not as intellectual as us, that they are more animals. Now, there was even one scholar that went as far as to say the reason they're considered fallen is because they do not worship Yahweh. So they are then outside of our communion, as it were, outside of our community. With that being said, is it possible, especially if we're looking through the lens of cryptozoology, is what's occurring in the Bible is that we are getting references to another group of human being that existed at the same time that anatomical Homo sapiens had existed, and this is just simply a part of the oral tradition of us sharing the world with other Homo sapiens.
Sorry about losing track a little bit here, because I was looking at some of our comments, looking for some questions here, but
well, we know
totally lost my train of thought on that one. You're gonna have to.
That's okay. No, we know that the world. We know that we as human beings share this world with Neanderthal. We know that because we have evidence of mating with them, interbreeding with them. Also, the Denisovans. We know now that the Homo florensis, the little hobbit there. We know that these other creatures existed in the world around us. And is it possible these biblical stories is a part of an oral tradition that is simply witnessing to other of our other dead ends in the human family that went extinct? Is it possible that we're talking about a sighting of a Neanderthal, or the interactions between early Semitic people and Denisovans?
Absolutely. No, I think that actually that may be one of the most rational explanations, because with anything, when we see people who are different from us, especially in earlier periods in history, when mass communication or awareness of other cultures was at a much lower level, we tended to believe that if you went off a given map, well, there were monsters there. I mean, it's literally inscribed in a great deal of maps. Anytime you go past the edge, there be monsters here. And so we would see people who looked different, people who dressed differently than us, people physically who had differences than us, and we would tend to otherize them. We would tend to believe that they weren't as human as we were, or possibly not human at all. And if a race of any sort was particularly tall. Now, this is interesting because a lot of the supposed giant bones that have been discovered over the centuries have been of people who were the enormous height of 7 or 8 feet tall. Now, today, that sounds like, a particularly large basketball player, not like a supernatural entity, but at different periods in human history, a great deal of humans were notably smaller. And so an 8 foot tall person, while not completely unheard of today at all, would have been almost beyond belief at that time. But we already know that the physical possibility of a person that tall is not just a possibility, but that it does happen from time to time, that gigantism itself is actually something that happens. So I think that, again, as you were saying, either a different culture that they didn't fully understand, people with a significant physical difference, but also somebody who was suffering from a form of gigantism. Any of these people could have given rise to those legends. And it is interesting about the word Nephilim is that although it does mean, the etymology is supposed to mean the fallen, it also doesn't necessarily mean that they were physically giants.
Right, right. Although it's interesting because in the Bible it says that people in their eyesight were like grasshoppers. So we do have this idea that there is a size difference, that these are immense people. But like you said as well, if we would go back 2,000 years, the average Roman legionnaire would have been about 5 foot, 5'2". And whenever we think about, diet comes into play as well too. And then we think of like the Vikings. I see one of our
Yeah, Jeff
listeners
was saying that.
Vikings. We're talking that somebody about 5'8" would have been considered a giant in that particular. So whenever we get to somebody like you said that's pushing over 6 feet tall. I'm 6 feet tall. My son is 6'3". He's big. He would have been a giant in that world. Now, to take that even to farther extremes, and where we go up to about 7 foot or a little bit over 7 foot, that is something that would have been a wonder to that world.
And as Jeff just pointed out a moment ago, talking about Vikings too, as we were discussing last week, the fact that many Viking warriors who would have been the ones charging into a village, whether it was a village, in the Americas with Native Americans, whether it was an English monastery, wearing animal skins, wearing bear skulls on their heads, which really exaggerated their appearance. And I tell you, some little tonsure-headed monk, who spends all of his life, looking over books, suddenly sees this enormous skull-headed, man in armor with a flashing blade bursting through the door of a monastery. That person is going to look very much like a giant to him. And
Yes.
so I think that, again, all of these things contribute to it.
Yeah.
But there's
not only a giant, but he would also be cast in terms of being an animal as well, too, right?
Yeah,
because it was so far beyond the civility of that particular Judeo-Christian world that would have been seen as a monster rather than a man.
Now, there's another aspect to so many of the giant myths, however, and these are speaking about animals and things that are less human, is the truly non-human giants that exist within folklore. One of them, I think, that's always very fascinating to me is the legend of the Cyclops. Now, Cyclops is the sort of thing that we tend to think of Greek mythology, but references to Cyclopses go back, at least in literature, back to almost 1,000 years AD, and often referenced not from mythological stories, but referenced alongside myths as creatures that potentially really existed. And this has led people in modern time, including cryptozoologists, people with paranormal interests, to search out evidence of Cyclops, a creature that was sort of a precursor of the Cyclops existing in real life. Now, biological cyclopses do exist, and humans and animals are sometimes born with deformities that create a single cyclopean eye, and that's pretty uncommon. And certainly there's some chance that could have led to it, but more and more people are pointing to supposed fossil evidence of cyclopses. And there was a fascinating one I saw when I was doing some research for this piece about these cyclops skulls that were discovered in Sri Lanka. And these are enormous. They're real, completely real skulls, these enormous skulls with a huge central sort of orbital or what they believe to be an ocular cavity in them. And this convinced quite a few people. By the way, this is an image here of about a 700 BC Greek sculpture of a Cyclops. And it's interesting because you'll note that it looks like a deformity even in the carving. And then, of course, this Sri Lankan woman standing in front of this skull. And as I say, it's not a hoax. It's a completely real skull. But it has led a lot of people to believe that these enormous bones and these enormous skulls they have found were the skulls of Cyclops. However, this has got to be pointed out, that any biologist would be able to immediately recognize that what these really are, these are the skulls of pachyderms, basically elephants, and that some of the larger species of elephants, especially ones that are extinct at this point, would have these huge, what appear to be ocular cavities, but it's not. It's actually a nasal cavity. But, you know, I can imagine if I stumbled across this in the wild and didn't know what I was looking at, I'd have probably thought that was a Cyclops skull as well.
Yeah, we do know from evidence in the Greek world, especially because Homer had so talked about the Cyclops Polyphemus in the Iliad. Oh, I'm sorry, in the Odyssey. We know that people did indeed go to basically what would be equivalent to sideshows, 3,000 years ago, where they would be taken in to see the skull of Polyphemus, and it turned out to be either the skull of a living elephant, or quite possibly the skull of a mammoth or a mastodon that was uncovered as well too. You have to understand, people in Greece probably were not coming upon elephants very much. So if you were tending to your garden or you were plowing up the field and you came across a huge skull that was a fossil of a mammoth, you wouldn't know what to do with it, right? You would have no idea what this might be. So you would immediately start putting this into correlation with what you know from the world around you and what you've heard. So obviously, I don't have any perception of what an elephant is, but I do know what a Cyclops is, and that fits the description pretty gosh darn well.
And while it may not have convinced anybody it was a Cyclops, you can imagine the absolute horror of the person in those circumstances if they'd actually seen a living elephant. The idea of a living elephant, again, in an era when mass communication, when knowledge of other cultures and knowledge of other species, continents away was so uncommon, this would have been a monster from a nightmare. The gigantic tusks, the bizarre, appendage on the front, everything about it would have seemed like it was some kind of truly monstrous creature. And so many of our cryptozoological beliefs, not just now, but cryptozoology has been a part of human consciousness since the beginning, because we've always believed in creatures that were fantastic and extraordinary, that were supposed to really exist, but that may have been at any given time a misinterpretation. One of my favorite curiosities in the Bible is in the book of Leviticus, which sets the sort of laws of behavior, for the early Jews. It lists various animals that you can eat and you can't eat. And one of the things that you cannot eat, it was a list of birds you couldn't eat. And among the birds you couldn't eat were bats. Now, bats aren't birds. They're not birds on any level, but they fly. And so that simple misunderstanding, imagine that multiplied 1,000-fold. The idea that being able to see something that has vague similarity to something you're familiar with, but is much larger or has some very strange shape. I can imagine these creatures being considered like something that had risen from the bowels of hell in the eyes of some early person laying eyes for the first time on a creature they'd never seen before.
Right, definitely an abomination of nature. I mean, you could put this into the whole scheme of religion. This was definitely seen as something that was not of the upright world, right? This was something that was a pariah and something that obviously had some sort of evil tendencies to it because it was misunderstood or not understood at all.
The gentleman was just commenting a moment ago that I think he was saying it was Greek soldiers discovering the bones of elephants in attempting to reconstruct these creatures, Greek sailors, in attempting to reconstruct whatever they believed these bones were, actually placed them in an anthropomorphic shape, believing that they were the bones of some giant, literally a giant in the way that we think of a giant today. And so again, very, very easy to see how convincing proof of the existence of a fantastical creature like that could easily become accepted as common fact, even in the face of a misunderstanding like that.
But one of my favorite, historians, the father of history, Herodotus, stated that he saw the leg bone of the great hero Ajax, and it was about 11 feet tall. So he saw that Ajax was a giant as well, and he was obviously seeing the leg bone, the femur of some sort of extinct animal. So we can see how even the father of history has misidentified something that was not like commonly seen.
I think that people tend to make the foolish assumption that if you go back 500 years, 1,000 years, or so, that people were somehow less intelligent or that they were ignorant, and none of that is true. People were just as intelligent, but the amassing of knowledge was just less because they had thousands of years less of accumulated knowledge to work with. And so even an incredibly intelligent person was still working within the bubble of knowledge that was available. And that could lead an extraordinary researcher, a scientist, a person of great learning to make what seems to us to be an absurd conclusion, based on something that existed in the natural world. I was just showing a moment ago some images, by the way. We were talking about hoaxing before, which has convinced a lot of people, again, of the existence of the Nephilim and these giants, because some people who do some very clever Photoshop work, admittedly, frequently use real archaeological digs and a little bit of clever imposition to create these images that appear to show giants buried in the earth.
Getting back to the idea about people, 2,000 years being more primitive than we are. One of my favorite cryptozoologists in history is actually our very own Thomas Jefferson. He was fascinated by the natural world around him, and he indeed had no kind of religious preconceptions of what was going on. He was very much an enlightened man, a man of science. But whenever he was gathering the Lewis and Clark expedition, he told them to keep their eyes open in case they would encounter mammoths or ground sloths, because these things were being discovered pretty readily at this time. Also, it's interesting that George Washington did not know about dinosaurs. Dinosaurs did not exist in George Washington's imagination. So anything that was being found prior to, 17 or about 1808 or 1806, it would not have been understood as a dinosaur. So something else was going on in this world. But by the time we get to Thomas Jefferson, he also had this idea that these creatures may still be alive and out there. So again, it has nothing to do with people being more primitive. It's just the era in which they lived.
Exactly. So we're actually running towards we're in the final stretch here. As usual, we can run through things pretty quickly, but I did want to quickly touch on a couple of the other beasties in our sort of our menagerie here. One that is very, very well known in popular culture is the Kraken. Now, this is a picture from the I believe it was 1984, maybe, film Clash of the Titans, which a lot of us who grew up in that era were absolutely in love with. The more recent 2010 version of Clash of the Titans, again, portrayed the Kraken as this enormous, very anthropomorphic beast with huge coiling tentacles. But in old folklore, the Kraken actually comes from the Norwegian Norwegian folklore, and is supposed to possibly mean the word Kraken supposedly means something along the lines of a grapple, as in maybe tentacles, but was believed to be either an enormous ship-killing octopus or a squid of some kind. And what's fascinating to me, and has always fascinated me about the Kraken legend, is the idea that this was usually based on actual observation. This isn't necessarily based on a simple misunderstanding, but based on enormous tentacled beasts, which supposedly were able to pull a ship down. That certainly seems like a little bit of a stretch to me. So I love during the summer months, I actually am a harbor guide, and I talk to people a lot about the strange life forms that exist out in the bay where I work. And people ask all the time about octopus and squid. This is a fanciful depiction of the Kraken from the Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm sure many of you have seen the Pirates of the Caribbean what was it, Dead Man's Chest, about Davy Jones, who controlled this enormous squid and would call him forth to bring ships down to the ocean. But I've always wanted to know whether such a creature could really exist. And of course, we've learned, especially in recent years, that maybe not on the size of the creatures that we see in the movies, but we have definitive proof that these enormous squids actually do exist out there. And that, to me, is incredibly fascinating, because you do have to ask yourself that if these enormous squids that are in some cases maybe even 10 meters long really do exist out there, and we have discovered them, what does still exist? What does lurk still down there in the depths? Because could a much larger version of this creature still exist and survive?
Right. Yeah, we only have photographic evidence of the Architeuthis, the giant squid, within the past 2 decades. So this is a relatively recent discovery. Things have washed up on shore, but the idea of a living one has only been captured by the Japanese, I believe, was within the last 2 decades. But we know first living capture of an Architeuthis, of a giant squid.
Now I apologize. I actually think I cut your audio off when I ran that.
No, that's right.
That was by accident. I didn't realize, with all the other overlays, generally we get to speak over it. But that clip was, I believe, from a Japanese ship, an expedition, and they captured actual footage of a squid that probably was a good 20 or 30 feet long, which again,
Right.
absolutely enormous.
Now, the interesting thing about this is we do have evidence from sperm whales that have been captured that they go into the very abysmal depths, and they're waging some sort of battle down there with squid that are much larger than the ones that have been seen so far, because of the impressions upon the whale's skin.
Yeah, and Jeff was just saying that the size of the ships that are often probably in use, if you go back a couple of centuries, would have been maybe smaller ships, and so even though they may not have been taking down giant frigates and brigantines and sailing ships, that a large enough squid could easily capsize a smaller boat, a skiff, or a sloop of some kind, and so maybe the context of the size of some of these creatures escaped them, but it is entirely possible that in some ways that they were encountering creatures that were big enough to be considered a ship killer.
Absolutely.
Now we have one other creature that I want to address before we end it for the evening. Let's see. Looks like Ken has something to say here. Our producer behind the scenes: the largest giant squid ever recorded by scientists was almost 43 feet, 13 meters long, and may have weighed nearly a ton. Now that is an enormous creature. However, still not the size that we would get used to seeing in science fiction and fantasy films. And so I always keep my mind open, and I imagine that, as we mentioned earlier, that there are things out there that we believe don't exist because we haven't been able to lay eyes on them, but that could, especially in the depths of the ocean, which is so underexplored, could actually still be out there. And when you deal with squid, one of the things that happens whenever these colossal squids and these giant squids have been brought to the surface is their bulk is almost impossible to support out of the water. And so frequently when they come to the surface, it's at the end of their life or they are dying. And so the idea that these enormous animals don't come to the surface doesn't seem all that shocking when you come right down to it. So I do have one more very, very famous creature, probably the greatest of them all, that I'd like to speak about for a moment, and that is, of course, in the Scottish Highlands, we have the beautiful expanse of a glacial lake by the name of Loch Ness, and Loch Ness, of course, always been known as the home. Look how cute she is, of Nessie, the Loch Ness monster. But there's been some fascinating research in the last few years when they've done actual DNA sampling of the water of Loch Ness to try to determine what kind of creature, if in fact anything, along the lines of the Loch Ness monster could possibly exist. And one of the most popular sort of pet theories that's been around for a great deal of time is that, based on its description, that the animal was a prehistoric plesiosaur, or many of them potentially, that had somehow survived from prehistoric times. But the possibility of that almost defies any log. Well, it really does defy any logical belief, as exciting as the idea is. And so DNA evidence certainly doesn't support that. But one of the most common descriptions always tends to show the Loch Ness Monster not as an animal like a plesiosaur with a single humped back, but usually multiple humps, these sort of almost coils in the water. And I've always been fascinated by what that could possibly be. We've found skeletons on shore in Scotland that people believe were possibly the skeletal remains of a creature like that. Unfortunately, turned out to be the skeleton of a whale, but very, very intriguing when looked upon. And enormous eels. Now, this is going to sound like a little bit of a stretch to suggest the idea, but there are species of eels that actually do grow large enough that they could easily, especially at a distance, if you don't entirely know what you're seeing, swimming along the surface of the water, create several sort of humps or coils in the water, and may have easily been mistaken for a creature like the Loch Ness Monster. So I know we've only got a minute or two before we peace out here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on Nessie, the great Loch Ness Monster, and what indeed she may be.
That's one of my favorite places on earth. Have you been up there as well too, my friend?
Not. I'll be in Scotland actually in a couple of weeks, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. You can see that the idea of the monster is probably a local personification of the loch itself. Whenever the wind whips through that glen, the waves become very serpentine and almost seem to be alive. It does seem as if the whole entire lake is writhing, So I think that a lot of that has to play. But I'm also fascinated by the idea of the surgeon's photo. Even though it has been claimed that this was a toy submarine with a head affixed to it, the iconic Loch Ness Monster right there. And from this point of view, it does appear to be something that's easily hoaxed. But there is a photo that is uncropped that shows the far bank. And I'm still kind of hesitant to rule this out completely as a hoax. I think there's something romantic in me that thinks that these things are out there. But that one photograph that's not cropped that shows Nessie out in the middle of Loch Ness, I'm still holding on hope, my friend. I'm still holding on hope that at least one of those pictures was not a toy submarine.
I grew up on stories of the Loch Ness Monster. I had a wonderful aunt who lived here from Scotland and used to love to tell me stories like that. And so in my heart, my kid's heart, of course, I always want to believe that sort of thing. And I have to say that the famous 1934 or so surgeon's photo right there that we saw again, that one, it's still a little bit difficult for me to believe. I feel like it just looks too small, to likely be real. But the idea that other large creatures, maybe not surviving dinosaurs, but creatures like, for instance, the oarfish, which is a remarkable, almost serpentine species of fish, could easily look like this great serpent, especially if it lifted its head out of the water. There's a little clip here. They're a truly frightening creature, not particularly dangerous, but truly frightening creature if one sees that in the water. And then on a gray stormy day over Loch Ness, when you can't see through the water like you can see in this picture, I can imagine easily believing that thing was much larger than it is. Not that they're not quite large to begin with. And so I hold out hope that there is some real creature hiding in Loch Ness that is the explanation for all this, that it's not just fancy, but I guess the final answer on that is for a different time. Yes, indeed. That is a very, very big thing.
Yeah, utilizing environmental DNA, though, it seems to be that our culprit for the Loch Ness Monster is indeed some very large eel. And if anybody cares to read a fiction based upon this idea, Steve Alton, who wrote The Meg, also wrote a book called The Loch. And in that, he contends that it is indeed a very large conger eel that makes its way into the loch, and it's seen from time to time. But it appears that it's something as mundane as that.
So, Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. This has been a whirlwind discussion. We went through a lot of stuff. We went through it really fast. There were some great questions that came in. Jeff Hilton, thank you for being a really active participant. Got some great viewers out there. Thank you, folks, so much for doing this. Next week, we'll come back, and I believe that next week's topic, we're going to be talking about the legends and the possible history behind the Frankenstein monster, a subject I'm always very fascinated by. As once again, Ron Murphy and Christopher Rondina, we're absolutely happy to have you folks. We hope that you will visit us again. If anybody's interested in picking up our books, you can find Ron's material easily online. I am at ghostboypress.com. I'll throw that banner up for just a second. And we hope that you will join us again next week. When you do, we will be back with more tales of Monday Night Monsters. Thank you so much for joining us. We do need to get some
Monday Night Monster merch out as well, too.
Hopefully.